Okay, so in this video for Chapter 5, what we're going to talk about is our LM curve. So similarly with, in microeconomics, we have a demand curve and a supply curve, and our two endogenous variables are price and quantity. In this model, we're going to have two curves as well, the IS curve and the LM curve, and our two endogenous variables are going to be real GDP and the interest rate. But what we need to do first in our LM model, which we really sort of had at the end of Chapter 4, is to put things in real terms. So that's what we're going to do first. So we had in Chapter 4 that M, that's our money supply, is equal to money demand, which is equal to nominal GDP, that's $Y, times this downward sloping liquidity function, right, L of I. And because in our IS curve we have real GDP on the horizontal axis, we need to put real GDP on the horizontal axis for our LM curve, right? And so remember that nominal GDP, what we call, what we symbolize as $Y in this model, is really just P times Y, where P is the GDP deflator, right? The price level. And so we can divide both sides by P. And so then our left-hand side becomes M over P, which we'll call the real money supply, meaning how much is that money supply actually worth in terms of goods and services. And then our right-hand side just becomes real GDP, now, just Y without the dollar sign, times our same liquidity function. And so this, equation 5.3 gives us our LM relation. And we'll be able to then graph that in terms of our output space. Now, because the central bank actually chooses the interest rate, it becomes just a horizontal line, right? The interest rate here, so you can see we put a bar over it, meaning that it's fixed, right? The Federal Reserve is going to choose the federal funds rate that it wants from the money demand curve in order to maximize its goals, right? And as we'll see, the Federal Reserve actually has two goals. Its goals are full employment, which is open to interpretation, but we'll talk about that. Usually it means whatever unemployment rate is consistent with stable and low inflation, and then stable prices. And as we talked about a little bit earlier, stable prices don't usually mean zero inflation. It usually means 2%-ish inflation, although some economists think it should be a little bit higher. Recently, we've been around that 2% area, but sometimes we've been a little bit lower. And other countries like Japan and even the whole European Union have experienced lower inflation because of somewhat depressed economic activity. So, all right, so now we've got our IS curve, which comes from equilibrium in the goods market with sort of a more complete picture of both consumer spending and investment spending, where government spending is still exogenous. And we've got our LM relation, which in some ways is not that complicated simply because we're assuming that the Federal Reserve sets the interest rate. Now, notice that if they're setting the interest rate, they can choose any interest rate, at least above zero, that is consistent with their goals. Also notice that with our curves by themselves, the IS curve and the LM curve don't actually give an equilibrium output, right? The IS curve gives all the combinations of output and the interest rate that are consistent equilibria in the goods market, and the LM relation just says, all right, well, we can have any output level at this interest level. It's when we put the two together that we actually get our equilibrium. So at the intersection of the two curves is where we have our equilibrium output. Now, this model is not actually going to be good necessarily for saying, okay, is the economy going to be, $21 trillion, or is it going to be $21.2 trillion in, 2021? What it's going to be good for is to understand what happens when people build a lot of houses, or stop building a lot of houses, or the Federal Reserve lowers the interest rate or increases the interest rate, or Congress increases taxes or decreases taxes. So similar to our supply and demand model in microeconomics, what it's really good at is sort of thinking about shifts in our endogenous variables when something exogenous happens. And so that's what we're going to use it for, right? We can think about, all right, well, what happens when there's a fall in demand? What is the fiscal policy that would be able to get us back to our original output? What happens when we're at the zero lower bound and the Federal Reserve can't cut interest rates anymore? So that's what we're going to use this model for.